So for the joy of the ethnographic sword lovers amongst you, today we have a sword that I think you're going to enjoy quite a bit. So we see it here. This is a takuba. It has various different pronunciations and various different spellings, but takuba is definitely a okay-ish term for the sword. And you'll see it's perhaps not extremely different from the Kaskara we saw in a previous video. At least superficially, it's not very different. And perhaps this is because they actually come from a fairly close-by region. So if you remember, the Kaskara comes from the Sahel area moving towards the Red Sea, whereas the takuba is the sword of the Tuareg people. So geographically it would be located like south of Libya, and then basically a big chunk of the center of the Sahara Desert moving down towards Mali and Burkina Faso, so towards the west coast of Africa. But it's definitely a desert culture and a semi-nomadic culture, and this is their sword. So we're going to look at it today. So as I mentioned, it's superficially not too dissimilar from the Kaskara. We have a very simple crossguard and a straight blade, so you can see it here. Apologies, I know someone mentioned in one of the comments in one of my previous videos that I never show the full sword. That is because my current setup doesn't really enable me to do so. But I will be moving soon, so I hope to be able to set up something that's a little more permanent and with better angles, so we can actually finally see the swords in all of their beauty. But back to the point. So what we see here is a very interesting scabbard. If you remember, a big difference compared to the Kaskara is that the Kaskara has this leaf enlargement towards the last third, whereas we see the takuba scabbard is way more straightforward, at least in its shape, because when it actually comes to decorations, this one is rather richly decorated on the leather part, and it has some like a throat here in brass, as well as a rather large chape. So it's, if anything, a more complex scabbard design, but it doesn't have that enlargement that you would see on the Kaskara. It also has these hanging loops, one of which is slightly damaged, unfortunately, so I have to be a little bit careful. But we're going to see all of this in a little more detail in just a second. I want to unsheath it first if I can, because it actually, yeah, I got it and it was stuck in the scabbard. So I needed a bunch of oil and letting it kind of work to be able to finally unsheath it. However, you'll see that now that it is oiled up, or at least it has been unsheathed, it moves quite smoothly. You'll see a broad, very wide and flat blade with a rounded tip. So we're going to look at these details in just a second. First, a little bit of interesting facts, perhaps, about the takuba. So, as we mentioned, it's a Tuareg sword. There's a unique characteristic. I mean, it's not really unique, but unique in perhaps more modern swords, such as these may be, because as far as I know, they're still in use, perhaps symbolically, but let's say they haven't necessarily become obsolete. But one interesting fact is that you'll always find the grip and the whole hilt area wrapped in some material that could be leather, as is the case here, but it could also be some kind of fancy metalwork, so silver or copper. And this is because there is a adversity among Tuareg tribes people to touch iron. So the workaround is basically to cover up the hilt with some other material. This is not a unique attitude or belief or tradition. Historically, steel, like cold steel, was associated with a whole bunch of different magical characteristics, even in Europe. So, for example, it was associated with capturing or holding on to the souls of fairies or of the dead. So it's not really surprising that the Tuareg have this belief as well. What is perhaps interesting though is that they go to the extent of not touching iron or steel if they possibly can. There's also a kind of sociological distinction among their culture. So there is a distinction between what is the, I suppose, the warrior caste, if I'm not sure the term is correct, but and the labor or practical work kind of caste. So that would include, for example, ironsmiths or bladesmiths. So for example, there's even, so it might be that this is even a kind of sociological or cultural distinction within people with different functions within society. But still a very interesting fact, I think. So again, I would just want to quickly remind you of how superficially similar this kind of sword is to the Kaskara. So you'll see a broad, straight blade with a rather simple cross hilt. However, the similarities kind of end here, not only in the aesthetics, but also in our understanding perhaps of the sword itself. So whereas, if you remember the video I made about the Kaskaras, we have typologies that define different characteristics on Kaskaras, and of course they're not written in stone, but still they can help us kind of pretty comfortably determine a certain typology or another of Kaskara. This kind of information is not really available on the takuba. So takubas just come in a whole bunch of different variants and variations, and it appears that these variants have to do with personal preference, the wealth of the buyer or commissioner of the sword. So they don't necessarily have to do with like regional differences or like historical phases or simply different typologies. So you may have swords that are very richly decorated in the hilt and scabbard. You may have different shapes on the pommel, for example. You may have slight differences in the crossguard. The blade may be more or less broad. The taper may be different. The tip may be different. But these are all kind of one-off differences. So you'll often see each Kaskara being discussed as its own kind of piece. However, there are some common characteristics we can see, especially if we look at the blade. So the blade is normally a rather broad at the ricasso here at the hilt, and tapers down rather symmetrically to a tip that can be rounded, as is the case here. So it kind of has a bit of a triangular shape to it. So from here it tightens up, almost in a sense not dissimilar to certain typologies of medieval swords. The width of this of the base and how dramatically it tapers, that really varies a lot. You see some that are a little more just straight, a bit of a more typical blade, but some almost, if it weren't for the length, are almost have a taper that's almost kind of a cinque dea. At least to me it reminds me of it, in the sense that it's a really, really wide blade at the bottom, and then it tapers quite dramatically towards the tip. It's obviously very different in the sense that it's way longer, it doesn't have the grooves. And speaking of grooves, fullers are often present, as is the case of this specific takuba. They're usually hand ground, and they don't necessarily follow any like precise pattern, although you'll see this one is quite similar to what you find on some Kaskaras, so the 3 fullers. There are occasionally takuba blades which are of European origin, but perhaps not in the amount that you will find on Kaskaras or ninchas, for example. Apart from that, I think that's all the context I have to give you, and we can take a closer look at this one. Okay, so let's take a close-up look at the takuba. We'll first take a look at it together with the scabbard. I want to show you the scabbard and the whole assembly, and then we'll pull it out and show the blade. So let's look at the grip in detail. You'll see it's covered in a very leather, actually. It's super smooth and impressively well applied to the hilt, in the sense that If you don't look at the fact that there's a seam here, you may almost think this is wood, some kind of ebony or something, because it's so well applied and it's such a thin leather that it doesn't have any give, let's say. Unfortunately, here you see some damage, and you can see underneath the iron of the hilt there. So that's the part the Tuareg would not want to touch. The pommel area is really interesting because it has this almost almond-shaped pommel, I would say. You can see the peen coming through here. But what's interesting about it is that it's actually hollow. So this peen is coming through a hollow, unlike, let's say, medieval swords, where this is like a block of metal, and it actually even acts as a counterweight. In this case, in fact, you may even be able to hear it. There's something loose on the inside, which I don't know what it is, but this is a hollow piece of metal. Now, if we look at the scabbard, we'll see that it's asymmetrical. By that I mean that there is a clear front of the scabbard and a back. So actually I'll show you a overall view first. This is the front side of the scabbard. And then we flip it over here and you'll see the back. So the scabbard has this throat section, which is brass. It's like brass leaf. It's a very thin layer of brass with open work and a bunch of engraved decoration, like cut decoration. And at the back, it has these holes, which I think, my feeling is that they're to kind of fix it in place. But you see there's a lot of kind of rather rough work on the back of the scabbard here. So I don't know if it has a function, if these holes have a function or what. We have some decoration here too. It's a rather lovely little piece of metal here. And also it's really nice that you can see the leather underneath, I would say. Moving forward, we have, I'll show you here, these two hanging loops. These are made of leather too. But what's surprising to me is that they're really, really thin. This is not the leather I would use to hang a sword. So, I mean, leather is surprisingly more resistant than you would think. So I'm sure this works to hold a sword. I just feel very surprised that they would use such a thin piece of material to hold up a sword. And these loops, I won't touch this one much because as you can see, it's kind of breaking. However, we can look at this one. Are held in place not by any metal rings or anything, but they have basically a stitching. So they're stitched directly into the scabbard. The front of the scabbard has almost this box design in a sense. So it almost reminds me of those carved wood ceiling panels. So it has a raised edges here, quite half a centimeter maybe, a few millimeters raised. So it's a thick edge. And then the actual core of the scabbard is recessed within. And apart from here, where it raises a little, where there's the loop, so this is a kind of a continuation of the loop, I assume, comes under here. This box design kind of runs up to the end of the leather part of the scabbard, where we have a chape. This chape is actually impressive. It's about 10 centimeters. Plain metal, so nothing really to write home about, but yeah, there it is. And if we look at the scabbard itself, you'll see that there are some lovely decorations in the leather as well. So you'll see some engraved decoration here, some embossed actually is the correct word, I think. This is, I'm not sure if it's dirty or what, or if it's leftover of some form of decoration as well. And this just runs all the way down. Also here is interesting because outside of this, well, underneath this white residue, this is actually some kind of cord or thread or some kind of fabric, I think, on these two sides. So yeah, so a rather beautifully decorated scabbard. And if we look at the back side, we'll see it's rather more simple, so we don't have that box design. We have a central-ish stitching line, so it doesn't really go central. It's central towards the tip, but then it kind of offsets here, and so it's not exactly precise. But even here we have these little wave decorations. These run all the length of the scabbard, so they definitely put care and attention even in the back of the scabbard. So while this may not have been the most expensive object, I have the feeling it wasn't even the most utilitarian and poor version of it. Now I'll remove the blade with some care because it's a rather tight fit, so I did have to use a lot of oil here to be able to loosen it. And it's not easy to do on camera, so just a second. Yeah, there we go. So, and luckily for me, this area was the problem. So it had a bit of a rusty connection between the very tight throat of the scabbard and the ricasso. But once that was oiled up and loose, the blade is in surprisingly good condition. So let me show you. There we go. You'll see it's all beautifully shiny, actually, on both sides. So yeah, there's some rust here and there. Here, for example, there's some little rust sign. I'll need to clean it. But for a blade that was sold as stuck in its scabbard, it's in surprisingly good condition, I would say. So in terms of the blade, we already saw its broad shape. So we have this broad forte, and then it tapers down both in width and in width in this direction and in this direction as well. And it tapers down into a very slender blade up here on the last third. It's quite flexible too, so let me show you. You'll see it bend rather easily. But the forte here is actually rather thick. We have maybe 2 millimeters perhaps. This section here does not bend. It's a slab of steel. In terms of the decorations, we have 3 fullers. They're centrally positioned. 2 of them run up to the first fifth, more or less, and the third one runs up to maybe a third, about 40% of the blade, I would say. And what's also interesting in terms of the decoration of the blade, you probably already noticed, but I'll call your attention to them. We have these half moon faces that are a very typical decoration on European made blades, but as we saw with our Kaskara video, these were often reproduced by local blacksmiths. So I have the feeling that these are not the European ones, but I still have to do my research on these, so take that with a grain of salt. But let's say my first uninformed assessment here would be that these are probably added by a local blacksmith on a locally made blade. One thing I noticed, and I hope it comes through on camera, is that the forte, you'll see this is made for paring. It's thick and blunt. So all this section here, not unlike many European blades. It almost has a lip here in the sense that, I don't know if this is through use, if it was banged on something, but it doesn't seem to be the case because it's really smooth on the side. I think it's just a part of the blacksmithing. It wasn't then smoothed down, but you can see this kind of lip on both sides, on all 4 sides of the blade, actually, I would say. And as you move forward, though, the blade becomes really, really sharp. So when we get into the second half of the blade, so the debole area, we're moving towards the tip. This section here, I actually have to be a bit careful touching because it's sharp enough that it could cut. So yeah, so sharp. The tip is rounded. This is relatively common feature on takubas, so it can be pointy, but if you find a rounded one, it's not a sign of damage or of incorrectly made blade. This is just a choice. What's also interesting, you'll see some very deep scour marks along the blade. So I wonder if these are signs, because they run mostly along the edges. You'll see not so much at the center, but kind of here. And they run basically up to where the blade has been sharpened. So what I'm wondering here is if this is a sign of sharpening perhaps with stone or with some kind of coarse, very coarse tool or material. So unlike a, let's say, a gentle file that leaves small signs, here we really have really deep scours. Also, one interesting thing here is that they run parallel to the blade. So if these are indeed signs of sharpening, it also perhaps shows a different technique in sharpening. Lots of times in blades I've seen that are sharpened, you'll see like a diagonal file work, so it goes kind of this way, whereas here you see a very parallel to the edge kind of mark. Although you do also see the fine, the signs of like the fine filing here, the end sharpening. So here instead you have these perpendicular little marks. So if anyone's an expert in ethnographic sharpening techniques, I would really be happy to know if these are indeed signs of sharpening, which kind of makes sense to me. In any case, as you can see, very few rust marks. So this is a sword that I think will benefit by a very light cleanup, just a removal of a little bit of rust and this kind of dirt here. And I think once it's done, it will look stunning. So thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you soon in another one. Bye.